What if I told you there was a king so messed up physically, people straight up thought he was a demon in human form? No fairy tale, no exaggeration. Meet Charles II of Spain, the king whose face made his own court whisper behind his back that he was cursed. Not just odd-looking, legit terrifying. They didn't call him Your Majesty. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. But here's the twist. There was no curse, no witchcraft, no black magic. What destroyed Charles was his own DNA. More specifically, the insane obsession of one royal family, the Habsburgs, to keep power in the family. And by family, I mean really in the family. This wasn't just bad luck or some tragic fluke. Charles was engineered by generations of incest, backroom marriage deals, and royal egos bigger than empires. When Charles died, doctors performed an autopsy, and what they found? It was so horrifying, it actually made people believe the devil had a hand in it. Turns out, the truth was worse than anything supernatural. His jaw didn't just stick out. It looked like it had been pulled forward by a hook. His lips couldn't touch. His mouth hung open all the time like a broken cabinet door. Foreign ambassadors met him and couldn't even hide their shock. This was the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, and he looked like he needed help feeding himself. But don't blame Charles. This was the price of royal inbreeding taken to the extreme. The Habsburgs had a rule: never marry outside the bloodline. So they didn't. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. And sometimes, the same person was their own cousin in 3 or 4 different ways. Charles's mom? She was also his dad's niece. Both his grandfathers? They married their nieces too. Try mapping that family tree. It doesn't branch. It loops like a noose. Doctors called his condition mandibular prognathism, but the world called it the Habsburg jaw, a fancy way of saying his face was broken because his family wouldn't stop screwing itself. He couldn't chew food, couldn't speak clearly. Every bite of a meal, an event. The palace kitchens had to prep his meals like they were for a toddler. Everything mashed, blended, liquefied. Even then, food would leak from the corners of his mouth as servants stood by awkwardly, pretending not to notice. Imagine it, a royal dinner, hundreds of nobles, and at the center, their king, struggling to eat like a man who forgot how to use his mouth. It wasn't just sad, it was humiliating. And yet, this man wielded more political power than anyone in Spain. This was just the surface. Eating wasn't just hard for Charles. It was a full-blown disaster. Every meal turned into a messy ritual. Soup would spill from the corners of his mouth like a leaking faucet. Solid food? Most of it didn't even make it past his lips. It just dropped out like his jaw had no idea what to do. Imagine a royal dinner meant to show off Spain's glory. Instead, it looked like a slow-motion accident. Servants hovered constantly, dabbing drool off the king's chin like it was part of their job description. But the worst part, he could barely talk. That twisted jaw didn't just ruin his bite, it mangled his speech. Words came out slurred, wet, and nearly impossible to understand. Foreign diplomats had to bring translators, not for the language, but because they literally couldn't comprehend what the king was trying to say. Even his own advisors struggled to piece together his royal commands. And get this, his own mother, Queen Mariana, wrote in private letters that she was terrified he'd choke on his tongue in his sleep. Think about that. The most powerful man in Europe, and he was a walking, wheezing, choking hazard. And here's where it gets really twisted. The Habsburgs knew. They knew their obsession with keeping it in the family was producing sick, deformed children. But they kept doing it anyway. Why? Because power trumped everything, even their own kids' suffering. By the time Charles was born, he wasn't just a king. He was a science experiment gone wrong. The final product of centuries of bad genetics, unchecked ambition, and royal pride. And the jaw? That was just the beginning. Charles's entire body was a mess. At 35, he looked like a malnourished child trapped in an adult's uniform. Barely 5 feet tall, with a massive bobblehead-like skull that sat awkwardly on a neck too weak to hold it straight. His arms and legs were thin as sticks, almost skeletal, while his torso was short and hunched, like someone had crushed him downward with invisible hands. The dude couldn't walk until he was 8. Most kids are running by 1. Charles, he spent nearly a decade crawling and collapsing. When he finally did walk, it was more of a lurch, bouncing between walls, using furniture like a senior in a nursing home. And his spine, so twisted, he was permanently hunched forward. He literally looked like he was carrying the weight of generations, because he was. But the damage wasn't just physical. Mentally, he never developed past a child. He couldn't read until he was 10, and even then, basic sentences tripped him up. Tutors described him like a cracked jar. You pour in knowledge, and it just leaks right back out. Emotionally, same story. Tantrums, screaming fits. He'd throw full-blown meltdowns over the smallest inconvenience, like a toy was taken away. And then, he'd go completely silent. For hours, just sit there, eyes blank, mouth open, gone. Even his hair betrayed him. Thin, patchy, falling out in clumps. His scalp looked less like a king's and more like a diseased animal's skin. Court painters had to get creative. They smoothed out the deformities, thickened the hair, softened the expression. But even the best portrait artists in Europe couldn't fully hide what Charles had become. And the scariest part, this was intentional. They made him this way. As Charles got older, things didn't just stay bad. They went off a cliff. Most people, even with health problems, kind of level out by adulthood. But Charles? He was falling apart like an old machine that should have been retired years ago.
I think of pasties in terms of what ones.
The most powerful throne in Europe was held by a guy who couldn't make a baby, like at all. Charles was married twice, not for love, for one thing only: produce an heir. That was the job. Period. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, a young French princess who probably thought she was stepping into a fairy tale. Instead, she got a nightmare. Their wedding night, a total meltdown. Servants later said she came out of the bedroom in tears, while Charles just sat there, looking lost, like he had no idea what just happened. Rumor had it, he tried, but physically, nothing worked. Doctors who examined him, and yeah, they actually wrote this down, said his genitals looked underdeveloped. In plain English, he had the body of a boy, not a man. But no one in the Spanish court dared admit the truth. So what did they do? They blamed her. Marie-Louise was dragged through hell. She got accused of being barren, was forced to drink nasty potions made of who knows what, went through painful exams, and basically became a walking science experiment. All because her husband's body was broken, and nobody could say it out loud. And it wrecked her. This vibrant, smart, hopeful young woman turned into a ghost. She spent her days locked away in prayer, crying, begging God to give her a child, one she never could have. Some historians even suspect the so-called treatments, mystery herbs, mystery tonics, and non-stop stress were slowly poisoning her. Whether intentional or not, Spain watched her fade away, while Charles kept sinking deeper into the collapse of his own bloodline. When Marie-Louise died, suddenly, mysteriously at just 26, the Spanish court didn't pause to mourn. They hit panic mode. Charles needed a new wife, fast. Enter Maria Anna of Neuburg, his second bride, or, more accurately, the next woman tossed into this royal horror show. By this time, Charles was in his 30s, and honestly, he looked like death warmed over. Maria Anna wrote private letters that were basically screams on paper. She was horrified, not just by his condition, but by the cold reality. There was no way this guy was fathering anything. Still, the court wouldn't give up. They summoned top doctors from across Europe. They dug through dusty old books full of ancient fertility secrets. They even tried magic. No joke. Charles was poked, prodded, examined, and humiliated by teams of doctors who measured every inch of his anatomy, desperately hoping for a miracle. But the problem wasn't something a potion could fix. It was baked into his genes. Meanwhile, Europe was holding its breath. Everyone knew the minute Charles died without a kid, it would be open season on the Spanish crown. And every empire, France, Austria, Britain, they all had armies ready to back up their claim. The war was coming. Everyone knew it. They just didn't know when. The irony, the Habsburgs spent centuries marrying their cousins to keep the bloodline pure, to keep power locked down. And their last king? He couldn't even seal the deal on night one. Their legacy ended not in glory, but in infertility. And since science clearly wasn't working, guess what the royal court tried next? Exorcisms. When doctors failed, they turned to priests. And not quietly either. These weren't backroom blessings whispered behind closed doors. They were full-on horror shows in a palace throne room, right in front of nobles and foreign diplomats. The church's take? Charles wasn't sick, he was possessed. Multiple demons, planted by witches. According to Father Froilan Diaz, the king's personal exorcist, evil had taken root inside the monarch. So what did they do? They poured holy water, mixed with powdered bones and relics down his throat. He'd gag, vomit, seize, sometimes pass out cold. They took that as proof. The demons were fighting back. Latin prayers were screamed, crosses shoved into his chest. Priests circled him, yelling as Charles thrashed on the marble floor like a man being electrocuted. And the guests? They just stood there, watching, because what else do you do when the King of Spain is foaming at the mouth in front of you? But it didn't stop there. Once they diagnosed Charles with spiritual contamination, they decided the whole palace was cursed. So in 1698, Father Diaz ordered a full-blown demon cleansing of the royal residence. And trust me, that was only the beginning of how weird things got. What happened next felt less like a religious ritual and more like a supernatural crime scene cleanup. Palace servants were ordered to round up anything that might be tainted by evil. Old portraits of former queens, gone. Jewelry from foreign dignitaries, gone. Even chairs and bed linens, tossed into giant bonfires in the palace courtyard. All of it was set ablaze under the watch of chanting priests, while nobles stood around pretending this wasn't completely insane. And Charles, he believed it was working. That's the worst part. His mind was so fragile, so childlike, but when priests told him the pain was from demons and the fire was chasing them out, he bought it. Every time he got sick again, he begged for another round. It turned into a vicious cycle. Get sick, call the exorcists, burn more stuff, repeat. By 1699, it reached full-on madness. Father Diaz, the lead exorcist, claimed to have cast out 47 different demons from the king's body. Each one supposedly had a name. One demon for his seizures, another for his twisted spine, another for his infertility. It was like Pokemon, but with demons and human suffering. After the last ritual, Charles collapsed. Didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't even move for 3 days. People thought he might have died right there on the palace floor. But here's the part that'll make your skin crawl. While the royal court was dunking him in holy water and screaming at ghosts, his body was actually falling apart, rotting from the inside out. Because of centuries of genetic damage no one dared to face. And when Charles finally died in 1700, just 38 years old, for decades they told everyone the king was bewitched, that some dark force had cursed him. But now that he was dead, the mask came off. They needed answers, real ones. So they opened him up. And what they found was so disturbing, the report was classified, locked down, because no one wanted the public to know the truth. But the truth got out anyway. Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pirola, the royal physician in charge, wrote one of the most chilling autopsy reports in European medical history. It didn't describe a man, it described something else entirely. A body that shouldn't have functioned at all. What the royal doctors found when they cut open Charles's body wasn't just alarming, it was like something out of a horror movie. Let's start with his heart. It wasn't even a proper organ anymore. It looked like a burned raisin, black, shriveled, and barely the size of a walnut. A healthy adult heart weighs about 300 grams. Charles's? Maybe 50. It was so weak and shriveled, the fact that it managed to keep him alive for 38 years was a physiological freak show. Then came the lungs, rotting, slimy, filled with pus and blackened flesh. One of the assistants reportedly gagged so hard he ran out of the room. The smell? Think wet garbage left in a summer alley, except it came from a king's chest cavity. But the worst was still to come. Inside his abdomen, things were pure nightmare fuel. His intestines, completely decayed. Gangrene had eaten away so much tissue, the doctors weren't even sure how digestion had been happening at all. Spoiler, it barely was. Then they got to his manhood. The structures were so underdeveloped, one doctor quietly asked if they were examining a child's body by mistake. But nothing compared to what they found in his skull. When they opened up his head, there was way too much fluid. Modern science calls it hydrocephalus. Back then, they just called it unnatural. His brain was swollen, discolored, and mushy. More like old porridge than a functioning organ. It explained everything. Why Charles couldn't focus, couldn't speak properly, why he threw tantrums like a toddler. His brain was broken from the start. Dr. Pirola, at the provision, the man who led the autopsy, was consumed. It is a miracle this body sustained life for as long as it did. It contained not one single healthy organ. Let that sink in. Not one healthy organ. And just like that, the whispers about curses started all over again. Because people looked at that autopsy report and said, if that's what was inside him, maybe it was the devil. But the truth was way darker than magic. It wasn't demons, it was DNA. Charles wasn't cursed by witches, he was destroyed by his own bloodline. A walking cautionary tale about what happens when people care more about power than basic biology. And then he died without an heir. Boom. Europe went to hell. The War of Spanish Succession tore across the continent, killing hundreds of thousands and turning royal families into enemies overnight. All because one family couldn't stop marrying each other. Charles II didn't just mark the end of a dynasty. He proved that the deadliest force in a royal court is the one already flowing through their veins.